Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Modern One and to this Café des Artistes event number 12. So my name is Neil Cox, and many of you know me. I'm the Director of the Artists' Rooms Research Partnership, working with Tate and National Galleries of Scotland to develop and deliver high-quality research and public events like this one, focused around this amazing collection. And this is a really exciting event for us because, rather as we were able to do when we did a cafe in Leicester, we are talking surrounded by works of art. This is one better because we're surrounded by works of art by the artists that we're going to talk about. We will no doubt talk about some of these events, during the event this evening. The way we're going to work it, because of this privileged position, is that we're going to have a first talk, introductory talk on Lichtenstein, and then we'll have a break, which is an opportunity to have some of our nice wine in the foyer, because we're not allowed to bring drinks into the gallery, but also to explore the exhibition here on the ground floor, and also there are some rooms open upstairs. The important thing there is that we'll have to be back in this space at 7 o'clock. So it'll be like the theatre where we'll try and ring some sort of bell or something, make sure you come back. And then we'll have another talk, and we'll have that space that we always like to have for discussion. So, we'll be sending you homework, and there are bits of paper and pictures on your tables to help you along with that. Just to say that we also are running an extremely successful film screening programme, films by artists in the collection. And the next one coming is Ed Ruscha's Premium A Miracle. And I hope not to faint, which I did at the last film event, which I assure you was nothing to do with the fact that I was watching a film people throwing up at the time. But I think I've recovered, and I'll be there for that one. So please come along to those. Those events were conceived by Ruth, wave your hand, Ruth, and curated by Tom and Noel. Without further ado, I ought to say that, of course, if you want to find out what we're doing, please look at our Facebook page and like us. We're easy to find, Artists' Rooms Research Partnership on Facebook, and that clicks you into all our events and pictures of what we do. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Lucy, who's driving the computer right now. Lucy Askew has been Senior Curator here at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art since 2011. And she's been responsible for all sorts of exhibitions and displays, including this one, the Louise Lawler show and so on. And she worked on the Death to Death show, if you saw that, and also Generation. So she's done an awful lot since she's been here. I actually knew her also in the context of Artists' Rooms, because she was the first managing curator of the collection. And she survived, which is also impressive. And she's a member of the Board of Trustees of DCA, Dundee Contemporary Arts too. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who's going to introduce this session.
Great. First of all, can you hear me okay? And please do say if there's any technical problems, and make sure if you do want to interrupt, that's fine. But I think there is going to be, as Neil said, an opportunity to pose questions, have discussion, and think a little bit more about the works that we're surrounded by here at the Gallery of Modern Art. So I suppose I just wanted to sort of contextualise why Lichtenstein is here. Obviously this is part of the Artists' Rooms programme, but there's a history of Lichtenstein in Edinburgh that dates back a little bit further than the works that have come into the collection. And in a way this slide is completely redundant, because of course we have the real thing in the car, 1963, which the Gallery of Modern Art here in Edinburgh acquired in 1980. And this was a work that really was quite a bold move for the gallery to acquire at a time when the gallery had only been in existence for about 14, 15 years and was in some ways collecting in a rather conservative way. But it was part of a sort of a boost to try and bring in works that had been made in recent times. And around the 1970s and early 1980s, the gallery acquired a number of pop art works, such as David Hockney's work that you'll see upstairs in the gallery. There were works by Jim Dine, the American artist, and Joe Tilson. So it does form part of a sort of strategy for the galleries to acquire and build and think about pop art at a time in the late 70s, early 80s. But it wasn't without controversy, and in a way the gallery was a little bit behind the times, because in fact long before we acquired this work, Tate had acquired Wham in 1966. So in fact this is a really iconic work, and I'm just going to show you these images just to give you a sense of scale, because I think that's something that we could talk about with Lichtenstein's work perhaps later. So Tate had already started to really build their collections of living artists' work that was being made at that moment. This was a painting that was made in 1963, and it was acquired by Tate only 3 years later. So the Gallery of Modern Art were a little bit behind what Tate was doing. Elsewhere in the country, in Wolverhampton, there's a painting by Lichtenstein, this work from 1975, which they acquired in 79. So there was a sense that there was a bit of interest. So I just wanted to sort of contextualise that moment of thinking about Lichtenstein being seen in this country. And I suppose thinking about Tate again, they also acquired this work which we have here in 1980. So again, another work acquired around the same time as we did. And even though there's a sort of 15-year gap between Wham being acquired by Tate and us acquiring In the Car, the controversy around those acquisitions was almost the same, really. And in fact, the Tate's acquisition, Norman Reed, the director at the time, later said that it was the most talked about and publicly kind of discussed acquisition that the Tate had made since the Second World War. And in fact, the trustees of the Tate were incredibly sort of torn, and both Herbert Reed and Barbara Hepworth, who were both on the board of trustees at the Tate in 1966 when they were going to acquire Wham, both were vehemently against the acquisition. And so actually it did sort of divide the board, let alone the public. And so I suppose if we've got a question to ask, it's about the controversy perhaps around Lichtenstein's work, and what maybe is it something that we can still see today, or is that shock value no longer with us? So that was just something to contextualise where we are today. But in terms of the works that we've brought together in this exhibition, essentially you'll find groups of works by Lichtenstein that are brought together in series. And I can say a little bit more about how the works came together, but in terms of the way that we presented it, we've kept the works in those series. So Water Lily series are shown in room 7 next door with modern art works. This room is kind of about pop art, but also a group of works around reflections. And in the next room, you'll find nudes and compositions. And that sense of working in series was something that Lichtenstein did right throughout his career, and was something that he really kind of drew, I think, inspiration from the work of Monet, which you'll see next door. This piece, Water Lily with reflections, and the other two pieces that you'll see next door are works from a series of works that he made that take their kind of homage to Monet's Water Lily paintings, but specifically around the idea of reproductions of Monet. And that's something I think to bear in mind, that he wasn't just looking at the painting, he was thinking about how the works of artists like Monet and perhaps Picasso and other great modern masters are kind of permeating our lives. They're reproductions that we find in shops and postcards and posters. And I think there's something to consider with these works, that when he's working in series, there's a kind of homage to Monet, but there's also an interest in just the infiltration of images in our lives and that kind of saturation of media that we find everywhere. As I say, we've got a series of groups of works that deal with the nude, and we've put those together with a group of works called composition. There are 3 works. And I'm just touching very lightly on some of the thematics, which is really just to sort of feed some ideas, perhaps. But I think the nudes is something we can possibly talk about. I find them very kitsch, and I think there's something quite playful, but maybe we can unlock that a little bit more. Lichtenstein himself talked about them in terms of volume and forms that were sort of curvilinear, and trying to use the sharp lines and the bendet dots of his specific style to do things in a slightly different way. This work and a number of the other works that you'll see do also bring into play his interest in the work of other artists. So you see in the back, I think, a Van Doesburg painting, and a frame with nothing in it. It might be a mirror, it might be something else. So there's a sense with these works that they bring together a number of ideas that are in train in Lichtenstein's thinking. And then in this room, we're looking at works around us that all come from a series called Reflections, apart from the Tate piece and our work, but do have a sort of reference point within pop. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about sources, which is something that, again, we could maybe consider as a point for discussion tonight. So the works in this room, and I wanted to sort of dwell on these more perhaps than any others, because I think they are among the most interesting works that we're showing in terms of their technical ability, the way that Lichtenstein is looking at how we see, how we perceive, how we see images and how they're presented to us, and now how he's looking back on his own life, his own career, and his own sort of thinking. So this is a painting which you see over the mantelpiece that was made in 1988. And he took as his starting point a work that he had made in 1962, which is this work, Art. And the painting he had made in 1962, he goes back to in the 80s. And instead of seeing it as the painting he had made, he overlays it with images that are there to denote the frame and the reflections of glass, the way that you see something distorted or out of place or slightly kind of obscured by the way that the light hits the glazing. And I suppose this is a painting where he's creating 2 picture planes. He's creating a picture plane of the original painting, but he's also overlaying that with another work. He looked at those reflections as being almost abstract paintings in their own right. And Reflections was something that Lichtenstein was interested in right throughout his career. You see it in the water lily pictures, but you also find it in works that he made during the 1970s of mirrors that are, by their very essence, kind of dislocating something that has a kind of transience, a movement in it, because we see ourselves in a mirror and we activate that space. But with the mirrors and with the reflections as well, he solidifies and makes physical something that has this kind of sense of motion or transience or through perception is something that can't be fixed. But he fixes it in these pictures, in these paintings and in the prints, so that these reflections, these lines become like abstract paintings in themselves. And he talked about them very much in that way. Crash, which you'll see behind you, I wanted to talk about this piece because it demonstrates Lichtenstein's interest in process. And this is a work that comprises screen print and lithograph and woodcut. And often Lichtenstein would use these different mediums almost as interchangeable in themselves. And the master printmaker that he often worked with was a man called Ken Tyler, who worked with Lichtenstein on these prints. And Ken Tyler talked about Lichtenstein using the woodcut as if it was something completely other than a woodcut. So you might imagine a woodcut block to give texture and to give a sense of the wood which is used to make the print. But instead, in this print and in a number of the other prints, he almost disguises the fact that he's using this medium. And in fact, I think in this one it's probably a case in point where he either sanded down the wood block, or sometimes he would put some kind of varnish or resin on it so that it would create a really seamless image. So actually when the lights go up and you get a chance to look at this work, And in fact, our conservators have said the same thing. It's very difficult to denote what medium he's using in which part of the print. And I suppose I wanted to point this out because in all of Lichtenstein's work, you find this highly sort of mechanical way of presenting image. He breaks everything down into black lines, strong colours, often primary colours in works like these pieces, and the Bende dots for which he's known. Often you see a series of stripes as well. But although you have this kind of slickness and this real sort of sense of industry and a kind of industrial process, actually the processes behind them are always incredibly thought out, well conceived, and you know, there's a real intention to everything that he does. And so with this print, you'll also find that he's collaged areas, and when the lights go on, have a look, because you'll see the PVC that has been collaged over the top of it. So although he's kind of creating this sense of a solid reflection, actually he does embody the reflection with a bit of life and light by using this slightly reflective surface. So in all these works, I think you get a sense with Lichtenstein, and I certainly see in the reflection works, a sense of playfulness about picture making, about what it is that is artificial and conceived about a painting that we look at, or a print, or some kind of image. He's playing around with those kinds of conceits and ideas, and taking them into sort of different realms by using different materials, or giving us something that we think we know what we're looking at, but actually there's something else at play. I just wanted to say, I know we're probably a little bit short for time, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the sources and just to introduce some of the sources to some of these pieces. So this is the comic book strip that Lichtenstein used for In the Car. And as you may know, Lichtenstein, for the early works that he made in the early 1960s, he would frequently go to sources such as This Is Girls' Romance, and there are a number of comic books that he would draw from, and in the archive of the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, they have his notebooks and his jotters filled with cuttings and clippings from these sources, which he kept over time. And they don't quite know at what point he cut them out and stuck them into the book. It might be that he had an assistant later, but certainly by the 90s they were all sort of quite carefully cared for. And so, although I suppose it's important to say, whereas our painting In the Car was made in 1963, the prints in the Reflection series and the other works in the exhibition are all from the 1990s. And these are works, the Reflection series, are works where he went back to those source materials. He hadn't really looked at them since the 60s, but at this time, in the late 80s and early 90s, he goes back to them. He goes back to his clippings, his cuttings. And unlike Reflections Art, which was a painting that he had made, and he kind of goes to it, these are kind of imaginary pop art paintings. Crash is possibly a picture he may have made, but in fact it's kind of an imagined one. And so there's a sort of another layer to those works as well, in the way that he's reflecting on what could have been or what it might have been, or, you know, looking again at those sources. And so here you have the source material for Crash, which is from a Second World War comic book, which he often used. And I think you start to see, when you start to look at these images side by side, the ways that he re-articulates the composition, that it's not just a straight copy or a straight rendition, that there are always slight changes. So for example, with this, the Bende dots in the original comic book become a series of lines, the colours are strengthened. This is probably a nice one to look at, because you see how stylized and sort of stereotypical he makes the image, having taken a sort of brunette figure. I think that idea of turning her into a blonde-haired, slightly sort of weeping woman with red lips almost sort of heightens this idea of the stereotype even further. And he takes away that sense of the narrative. So whereas you would have seen a bubble and kind of something that would put it into the storyline from which these came, he dislocates the word, so there's no sense that you can read the sentence here. Sometimes he changes the sexes of his subjects. So here we had two women talking, and the whole colour scheme here again is completely altered. And I do get a sense that in a way, like when he was looking at the work of other artists, it's almost about reducing the information down to a very basic number of forms. The colour, sometimes the detail behind the figures is reduced to so that your focus is really drawn to the figures or to the composition itself. And that's something that Lichtenstein again talked about quite a lot, which was his intention was to create a kind of harmonious composition, and that the way that line and form and shape fit together would be, the way that was the thing that he was most sort of careful and most concerned about when he was making a new picture. The nudes are interesting because, of course, he not only takes the subject but he undresses them, which adds another sense of kitsch or provocation. And like this one, I suppose this is an example of where all of that detail is taken out, and we're left with a sort of a far flattened surface. So actually the way that Lichtenstein's style works is often to completely flatten the space, and you see it very, very strongly in these works. And then, of course, source materials were not just, as I said earlier, not just about the comic books and popular culture, and of course he used advertising in other parts of his work, but also the reproductions that, as I mentioned, of works like Monet. And I'm just going to end with this one because I think this is a rather nice one for us here, because we've got Neil, who I know is a Picasso specialist, and two paintings sort of spring to mind for me when I look at Lichtenstein's work, where he's kind of pulled apart little bits of different paintings by Picasso. So the nose in modern art that I've just shown you comes from Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I think the silhouette, which you find here, just the sort of grey silhouette there, really, for me, just spoke to me of this painting, which I know from having worked at Tate, and this is it's been in Tate's collection from the 60s, I think, so if not earlier. So I think, it's very likely that Lichtenstein would have known them either from reproduction or certainly will have visited them. He had an exhibition at Tate in the 60s, and so would have seen, I'm sure, Les Trois Danseuses, the Street Dancers. And so as well as sort of going and creating whole images, I do like the sense that Lichtenstein was kind of plucking little motifs or things that he saw, taking them and putting them together. And I suppose more than any of the other works that we have in the exhibition, these for me are works that speak of kind of playfulness and parody, the kind of generic Picasso, what you might imagine if you sat down and drew a Picasso. This is kind of, the comic book version. And I think it's very knowingly done. So maybe there's some points for discussion in there, I hope so. I mean, it's really just to give you some starting points for thinking over a glass of wine. And of course, if there are any questions or things that you want to ask me, I'll be out there as well. So thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody. So we're now going to hear from our second speaker. I'm delighted to introduce James Bergen, who has come from New York. James did his PhD at the Courtauld Institute, working on the filmmaker Stan Brakhage, and the relationship between Stan Brakhage and different artists in the 50s and 60s. And he's working on that as a book now, is that right?
Yeah.
And he's published quite a bit in various different places. And he's interested in that kind of crossover elements between film and art in the 60s. So James is going to talk to us for a little while, and then we'll have some space for more discussion.
Okay. So I wanted just to think a little bit about some of the works in this exhibition in terms of pop art quite generally, and thinking about it through the idea of time. So this rather cryptic sounding title, Pop Time, Now, Then and Late, I hope will make a bit more sense at the end than it does now at the beginning. So this is the cover of Newsweek magazine from April 1966. And what this text says down here, if you can't read it, is pop, it's what's happening. And this really suggests that pop, or pop art, is really what's in the zeitgeist, is what's being felt at this particular moment. And it says that it's happening in art, fashion, entertainment, and even in business. So it's really something that's kind of its moment, and it's being demonstrated here by this kind of exploding pop motif. I mean, if we're thinking about this in art historical terms, it's interesting that this is happening in 1966, which for many art historians would be the moment when pop art was kind of slightly moving out of fashion. But this is the moment that's being picked up in the media at this time. Now, this cover uses the idea of pop as something immediate, as something which is associated with speed and immediacy. And we can, of course, see that in the graphic depiction of the moving car, in the painting in the car, and also in this idea of an explosion, of something that's happening kind of momentarily. And this is there even in the word pop itself, which we might think about as being popular, like as in popular music, but it's also just the onomatopoeic noise of pop, something going bang, that's a kind of an immediate moment rather than something that has any sense of a long duration. Now, this is also something which was picked up in the 1960s, this idea of pop art's immediacy, when pop art was picked up by things like fashion. So this is a dress which is kind of based on Andy Warhol's appropriation of the Campbell's soup can, but it was produced by the Campbell's company as a dress which was marketed through these sorts of ads, but which is made of paper. So it's made as a disposable dress that's kind of its own moment and then can be thrown away. Pop art is mainly associated with the 1960s, and when we see adverts that use Lichtenstein's work in order to sell products today, they're usually kind of conjuring this idea of the 1960s, obviously a time of great affluence globally, a time when people were spending lots of money, a consumerist society. You can see why advertisers today still want to hark back to those times. So we're looking here at an actual American supermarket from the early 1960s, which was being mimicked, mirrored by pop artists in the mid-1960s. So here they're drawing very directly on kind of contemporary sources around these kind of this new ability to be able to buy tons and tons and tons of different products, to have a real kind of sense of choice in the 1960s. And here you can see this exhibition which took place in New York in 1964, where they made a kind of mock supermarket where works like Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans, his Brillo boxes and Del Monte boxes were shown in the context of this kind of mock supermarket environment. This is another view of that exhibition. And then these are some other works that were shown. These are Robert Watts's Black Eggs. So they're shown almost as these kind of consumer products. And this is the work that Lichtenstein produced for that exhibition, which is actually the carrier bag that you could buy some of these works like this as multiples, and you'd be expected to take them away in this carrier bag that Lichtenstein produced. Again, a throwaway object, something which is kind of its moment, and linked to this idea of the supermarket where one would do one's kind of daily shopping. Now, this idea of pop art being of its own moment, of the kind of swinging 60s, is one which has been questioned more recently by a lot of art historians who've really been thinking about how pop art might actually be representing a slightly earlier moment, might be representing the time of the childhoods, actually, of some of these artists, rather than their immediate present. So, although Lichtenstein is often using contemporary comic books, and Lucy showed us some of the sources for In the Car, which was from a comic from 1961, but he was also using these war comics, which, although were still being produced in the 1960s, had their kind of heyday in the 1940s and 50s. And comic books were very much a kind of cause of great discussion and debate throughout the 1950s, when this guy, Frederick Wortham, published this book, Seduction of the Innocent, which suggested that comic books were corrupting the youth. So when Lichtenstein is kind of referring to comic books in his work, he's referring to things which had a massively kind of public face a decade earlier, rather than necessarily something which was an immediate cause of discussion in the 1960s. This is just another work by an artist who I work on quite closely, this San Francisco artist Jess, who is working with these war comics in a very different way in the late 1950s, kind of collaging these sort of swooning male figures together into an almost kind of homoerotic scene in this comic book that he retitled Nance. The title of the comic strip itself is Lance, that was made in the 50s. Warhol's work, again, is often related to this idea of the immediate presence. So this work, Liz, by Andy Warhol, was painted when Liz Taylor was very ill, and there was the expectation that she might not live. So all of the kind of tabloids had all of these articles talking about the threat to Liz Taylor's life at this moment. But in some ways, you could also relate this painting, which was very current, to Warhol's earlier childhood and his childhood obsession with stars. He was a sickly child himself. He was laid up in bed with St. Vitus Dance for a number of years, and he would write off to Hollywood film stars like Shirley Temple, and he would receive their autographs in return. So this is something which is in the Warhol Museum of an autographed picture from Shirley Temple. And at the same time as Warhol is painting Liz Taylor in the Liz painting, he's also painting this image of Elizabeth Taylor in the film National Velvet, which I think is 1948 maybe, I don't know if anyone wants to correct me. But this is a much earlier film, and one which he associated with his own childhood. So he's still all the time kind of thinking not just about the present, but also you could look at some of these works as almost being nostalgic. And that's not usually a word which we would usually associate with thinking about pop art, this idea of kind of nostalgia and emotion that we might have within it. The art historian Thomas Crow has looked back even further, thinking about the kind of past sources for pop art. He's seen pop art as being almost a kind of a new American folk art. And here he's looking specifically at Jasper Johns' work and comparing it to some of these folk art flags, which were being collected by museums in the 1950s at the time that Johns is painting this work. Andy Warhol's painting of Robert Rauschenberg. This is a kind of portrait by Warhol of Rauschenberg and his family. It's titled Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, in reference to Walker Evans's photographic series made in the 1930s. And there's actually an example of this outside in the corridor from this series of photographs. And you can see this almost as referencing Rauschenberg's own youth, where he grew up in Texas on the Louisiana border, from a very poor southern family. But here Warhol's drawing attention again to this idea of childhood, of actually the kind of deprivation of the 1930s, rather than this idea of kind of consumerism and the pop sensibilities of the 60s. So that goes through the kind of the idea of the now and the then, and at the end I just want to go on to talk about this idea of late pop art, because if we return to this idea of pop's immediacy and it's taking the kind of current climate, what do you do with an artist like Lichtenstein, whose works from the 1960s, and this is how they were displayed at Tate Modern in the retrospective a couple of years ago, look very much like his late works. There's no kind of progression in style within Lichtenstein's practice. These nude works are often called his late nudes, but what does it mean to be late in this context? Usually when we think about an artist's late style, we think about it kind of being something which is almost kind of faulty, that it's a painter or an artist who's kind of almost lost their faculties to some degree, but whether something more truthful might evolve from within this. So thinking about Rembrandt's famous late self-portrait at Kenwood House here, where sure, the paintwork is much rougher, much more kind of bravura in style, but we're also getting something which seems to be a much more kind of personal, less showy image of himself. And the same has been said about Titian's late style, for example. And even the very late works of Claude Monet, looking at these works from the 1920s, just before his cataract operation, where the images of this Japanese bridge in his garden almost kind of dissolve into this very strange, almost kind of expressionist colour palette. And it's interesting that he's an artist that, as Lucy was saying, has been referenced by Lichtenstein in these later works of his own. Now, because pop art is so definitively connected to the 1960s, almost anything that comes after 1960 could be considered to be late pop art. And in fact, there have been a number of exhibitions of Andy Warhol's late works, which actually start around about 1970. And you think, well, how is that late when it's only 5 years after the works which are the kind of central works? One of the things that we might think about Lichtenstein as taking on a kind of a retrospective view, and this again goes back to some of the questions that Lucy was raising, is in this artist studio work where he's repainting his older works within the studio setting. So drawing again on earlier precedents of Matisse's Red Studio. And I'm interested in this because it recurs throughout a lot of pop artists' work in their later styles. So Jasper Johns repeatedly returns to earlier motifs in his work. This is the work Ventriloquist from 1986, and this is actually a depiction of a wall of his studio with this taped up, reversed colour version of the flag. Andy Warhol in the late 1970s painted this really long retrospective painting where he returned to the silk screens of the 1960s and repainted them all next to one another, collecting all of his earlier work under this kind of big new heading. And it's so big that you can't actually even photograph it properly from a single viewpoint. He also did these reversals paintings where he's kind of solarizing some of these images. And these reminded me very much of the works that we're looking at in this room, and some of the kind of complexity of these works that Lucy was bringing out, about where they're kind of returning, yes, to earlier motifs, earlier styles, but where they're not quite that same kind of return that's happening in the studio paintings from earlier on. And this is one of those mirror paintings that Lucy mentioned. Now, I'm interested, I teach, every year I teach a course on Andy Warhol's work at York, and we often talk about his late work and things which have been written about his late work, where people look at these skulls and say they're a kind of foreshadowing of his own death, and that he had an idea always of his own mortality, especially after he was shot and operated on and almost died in the operating theatre. This seems a rather kind of far-fetched idea, and it seems to attribute a lot of things to this kind of practice which Warhol was at great pains in other works to reject, this idea of the work actually reflecting his personal biography in that kind of a way. And there's a very interesting book by a theologian which looks at Warhol's Last Supper works, which are pretty much the last works he made before he died, which sees Warhol as kind of returning to these kind of inner truths of his Catholic upbringing. Now, this again, I think, is a rather kind of questionable idea that in the last works you're going to return to the great truths of your life. And I suppose my question for you, which we might think a little bit about, is these works, which Lucy mentioned, the nudes, are pretty much Lichtenstein's last works. When he was taken to the hospital and died, he was actually at work on one of these giant nude paintings. And I wonder whether we think that these reveal a kind of an inner truth. And what is this kind of idea that we might take away from looking at these works? Can they be considered to be late, kind of summative pieces, or are they just kitsch, as Lucy was perhaps saying earlier on? So I think that's all I have to say there.
Thank you so much, James. So thanks for those wonderful talks, raising kind of different perspectives, really. There were very different perspectives on the work, but maybe pointers to some fascinating questions about the way technique operates in relation to the notion of what this kind of art is, or what what it is to be an artist of this kind who's getting older and still producing this kind of work. Those seem to me to be the two things that came at us from that. The floor's open to you to say whatever you like about this stuff, to ask any questions of our speakers.
Hi, a few questions or thoughts come to mind when looking at Lichtenstein's work. I'm not an expert in his work. Just curious about his process, in particular the dots. I find them very striking. How does he achieve this? Is some kind of metal transparency that he paints over or something? Can you tell us about the actual process of the work?
Yeah, I think maybe James will know as well, but in his very earliest, really early pop art works, he did hand paint dots, but quite quickly, I think probably within, we're talking months, he started using a stencil. And in fact, what's interesting about the Tate work, Wall Explosion, because, in a way, the mesh that you see around the explosion, he's almost sort of using that as, that's the kind of material that he would have used, not probably exactly the same, but essentially he did use a mesh stencil so that he could get the precision. But they were hand painted. He never, printed them in any of his paintings. I mean, they're printed in the printed pieces. But he did use, and so in a way that work, that relief is kind of, it's not just a relief work made in steel, but he's using the kinds of materials he had in his studio, and you see them in images in his studio of like the stencils he used. Yeah.
Okay. My second question is, you showed some work by Warhol. I know they were practicing around the same time. Can you tell me to what extent they interacted with one another, what they thought of each other's work?
Well, a lot of Warhol's very early works are paintings of comic strips. So he did paintings of Dick Tracy, Superman, some of those sorts of things. Yeah, Mickey Mouse, which he stopped doing after he saw Lichtenstein's work, because he was sort of like, you can have the comic strips and I'll carry on doing other sort of stuff. But they certainly interacted with one another. I mean, the New York art world in the 1960s is tiny. There are like maybe, kind of 10, 11 major galleries, and of those, there are like 3 or 4 which are showing pop works. I'm not quite sure who they were. Can you remember who Lichtenstein was represented by?
Castelli.
By Castelli,
Leo
yeah.
Castelli, who was, so they both had the same dealer.
Yeah, by the late 60s.
So Leo Castelli was Lichtenstein's dealer from 1962, and I don't know what year he would have, Warhol.
That's 64 is the Castelli moment when he joins Castelli. So yeah, they interacted quite late. But whether they were fans of one another's work, I mean, I don't know.
Where did the idea of the Campbell soup come from? I remember reading somewhere years ago that Warhol's mother used to eat Campbell soup to take for lunch.
Yeah, he said that, yeah.
So is there any kind of Freudian significance?
He said that.
Oh, did he?
That's all I'm going to say. That's the Warholian response, is that he, that's what he said.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is a marvelous exhibition in the way it's been curated. It's very, very fresh. I was talking to Lucy during the break about an exhibition I saw Lichtenstein at Hayward in 2004, and I said that I felt a certain sense of Lichtenstein fatigue after walking through the exhibition. You mentioned that Lichtenstein played on this idea of media saturation in relation to Monet. But do you think that Lichtenstein, question to all of you, do you think that Lichtenstein also suffers from a sense of media saturation sometimes?
I'm going to ask James to answer first, because I think you've got the context.
Well, to a certain extent, yeah. I mean, I tried to get a photograph of this. There's a car insurance ad that uses this motif that's going on at the moment. It was one of those moving billboards that just moved as I was trying to take a picture. So I think certainly, the world is saturated with this stuff, and it signifies something in advertising, which when I was looking at putting together this talk, I tried to put together a few of these sorts of adverts, and actually they're using it in quite different ways, and it became very complicated very quickly. So I kind of just got rid of all of that stuff. But it's interesting then to compare these kind of almost cartoonized, that's a strange idea to kind of make Lichtenstein's work cartoony, versions that come into advertising and other forms of media. I think they actually make you look closer at the originals themselves, because as Lisa was saying, they're actually very formal. You know, there are very, very formal aspects of these works to do with the kind of flattening of the image. He's doing all sorts of things which the imitators and the people who are using them in advertising, or making fabric, or making bags or clothes or whatever, those people are not paying that kind of attention to the formal qualities of it. So I think it does make you kind of almost appreciate the work more.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've got some examples of the kind of materials that have come out of that Lichtensteination of advertising. It's almost like Lichtenstein's work's gone back into the medium that he first took. And they haven't, I totally agree with James, they don't have the power, the kind of, the close attention to the line and form that Lichtenstein has. So.
Thank you.
I was interested in this late idea, that the late Lichtenstein idea, and analogies with other artists. So, thinking about the nudes, there are quite a few cases of artists becoming a bit, naked lady obsessed in their old age. So Renoir is one good example. Picasso, well, whether it's a late surge or not, I don't know, but certainly the way in which he does it is a bit different in the last kind of 10 years of his life. And you've actually got a late one upstairs, which is a very late one, where you see this kind of, how can I put it, seminal performance, in the painting. And I wonder whether Lichtenstein is kind of knowingly, because he's a kind of, there's a wry sense of humour about quite a lot of this work, whether he's knowingly playing on the late nudes thing. And there are other examples of that. Those are just two examples. I didn't know what you thought about that.
Yeah. In the catalogue for the Tate exhibition, Sheena Wagstaff writes about these works. She looks specifically at Picasso, because there are other works which are much more kind of Picasso-y, which we also saw, but also at Matisse, and thinking about the blue nudes, especially because of these as kind of almost abstracted, kind of very much flattened figures, which are contorted into kind of positions which are much like the blue nudes. But I mean, if we think about those photographs of Matisse in his old age, with these young women in his studio, I think that this seems to be very much what these images conjure up to me. I mean, I'm intrigued to know what other people think about these works, because you could see them as being kind of profoundly sexist works by an old bloke in his old age. I mean, they weren't greeted with a tremendous amount of joy when they were first exhibited, and I wonder what people think about them here. Does anybody have an immediate reaction to it?
I my immediate reaction to this is that I find them quite difficult to work out what he's doing, and I'm not immediately drawn to them. I found works with other things, and they just strike me as really sort of like, maybe you didn't know that we did his main works, the idea that we're going to discuss them as main works and try and keep them profound in a way that maybe people more work about it in that way. But I'm inclined to agree with Lisa on each side.
There is a relationship between these things and work by other artists from the 60s as well, isn't there? I mean, other pop artists where, you know, the scene of the nude in the room. I mean, it might be interesting to talk about that a bit as well. Tom Wesselman and so on. I don't know if people know those works.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that. I suppose, again, it's about the moment. I thought that was really interesting what James was talking about, that kind of is pop of its time, or is it kind of somewhere else in the past or elsewhere? And in terms of, I mean, Lichtenstein does go to the nude in the 1990s. You know, I think there's maybe one other work earlier in the 70s, maybe, but really it is so in a way, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be the same. It doesn't seem to be the same thing. I think there is, there's a fascinating film of Lichtenstein making one of the very large paintings of nudes in his studio. And the thing that you really notice is that he's just grappling with the process. He's using black tape to delineate the breasts and the kind of these curved forms. And actually, he seems more worried about the process. And having spoken a little bit to a few, Jack Howard and people who knew Lichtenstein around this time, the people said, you don't need to do it like this. You could just paint the line. And no, I really need to do it this way. I want to find a new way of creating this form. So I do sort of wonder whether, and I do take the artists. I'm not saying that we should take everything the artists say as gospel truth, because there's all kinds of ways that artists mediate what they want people to see and so on. But I think there is something in his interest in just a kind of formal approach, and that these presented as figures, something we haven't necessarily looked at. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, but there's always a sense of humour with his work.
Lucinda, when you were talking about just Lichtenstein being very interested about like the process of the nudes, could it be in a way that he's in his old age going kind of back to basics of production in a way, and just being very minimalist in every detail and character, because in a way it's just like, I just remember this painting, it's like a nude descending the stairs, and it kind of reminded me in a way of kind of this period of just focusing in kind of very not basic in formal way, but basic in kind of production. It could be something also be seen as this.
In terms of, your questions about the process and
the
sort of simplicity. I mean, I think he had that attention to that kind of wanting to refine composition right, quite early on. That's something that he developed as he was developing his style of pop art in the early 1960s. The sort of refining of process and refining of style were sort of going hand in hand, I think. And his development of things like using the Bendo dot stencil was part of that desire to kind of really get to a point where he could achieve and realise, what he saw in his head. So I think he's doing that all the way through his career. If that's something you were saying might be particular to the late works. I think it's there throughout his career.
Any other thoughts?
This might be a stupid question, but something that strikes me immediately about all these prints is that the dots are bigger, and that suggests that they're the smaller source images, and then there's there might be some kind of intimacy about something really small being grown up quite huge. I don't know, it's just a sort of observation that maybe you've got a comment on that.
Yeah, I don't know if James might want to say something more because you had that image of the mirror, but I think it's where they take on their life of their own, and the way that I was saying, the mirrors, the works that are related to these kinds of, they're abstract paintings, and he was making works, in the 70s again, that were abstract. He called them, imperfect and perfect abstractions, and other forms of abstract images, but either using a form like a mirror as a starting point, or looking at the work of other artists. So in a way, it's almost like it is itself. I don't know.
I mean, these mirrored works, and these are obviously all playing off these earlier mirror pieces, are really interesting just for thinking about graphic conventions, and that they're not really representations of anything. I mean, we all know that a mirror doesn't look like that, but we all know that that's a mirror. So actually kind of how these sorts of conventions come into being for being able to see this as a mirror is something that seems to fascinate Lichtenstein throughout his career. And one of the reasons why these aren't simply kind of copies of another image, they're actually kind of drawing attention to things which otherwise we would see, otherwise we probably wouldn't look at that carefully. So these mirror images are copied. They're copied from adverts for like bathroom mirrors and stuff, which if we were looking at them in the kind of small ads of a newspaper, we would know that this is a mirror. But by blowing them up, certainly, it kind of estranges them. It makes us look at that kind of graphic notation in a very different kind of a way. And certainly these images and the way in which they shift their scale was quite unexpected to me, because I asked Lisa to send me the kind of printout of some of the pictures that were here, and when it said they were prints, I kind of assumed they would be kind of A4 kind of size. So I was quite surprised to find they're magnificent as prints. Just to even print on this scale is a massive achievement. But it is interesting the difference in address that they have due to this larger scale. Something where if you were flicking through a comic book and looking at something in a sequence like that, you're kind of drawn into the page, whereas this is being kind of presented to you. So an image like in the car is actually quite insignificant in the storyline, but it becomes something for us to kind of fixate on and imagine what might happen in the other frames. I mean, we know because we see them in this vitrine. But if we were just looking at the painting, we could imagine all sorts of different possibilities from something that's fairly insignificant on that page.
To what extent is the original artist of the comic strips acknowledged in this process?
Well, there's a question, yeah. I'm not sure about what the details are, but there were legal proceedings taken against him at various points. And there's if you look him up online, there are all of these amazing websites from like comic book fans who are all writing about the travesty of Lichtenstein, and the true artist is the artist of the strip. I mean, those artists were working mainly on a kind of a weekly basis, so they're making stuff all the time. It's a very different type of artistic process, and kind of where you lay the skill there, whether you think it's incredibly skillful that these people can compose this stuff and do it so quickly every week, or whether you think that it's Lichtenstein's ability to kind of pare this stuff down to very kind of basic, kind of formal questions from within it. And there's still a lot of debate between the kind of people who were on the side of these comic book artists and the people who were looking at it from a more kind of formal perspective. With Warhol's work, there were massive legal questions throughout the 1960s, because he was extraordinarily publicly wealthy in the 60s. It was very clear that he made loads of money out of these works. So the designer of the Brillo box, who himself was a failed abstract expressionist painter, attempted to sue Warhol for using his imagery. The person that took the photograph of his flower paintings also attempted to sue, and they all kind of got some money back, but not all of it, is how it turned out. But it is a very tricky question. It's the same question with artists like Louise Lawlow's work you see down there, who are actually directly working with these questions of appropriation.
What's your view?
I was going to ask what you were doing.
My view, I don't know. I think they're just very, very different art forms, and you need to kind of appreciate both of them for doing very different things and for having very different sorts of skills. I mean, I don't think that Lichtenstein in any way disparaged the work of the artist that he's drawing on. I think he had a great deal of respect for that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have used it as the source material. But yeah, I'm not sure whether I think either one of them is more or less skillful, or whether even skill is the thing, which is in some ways the distinction that at least these comic book advocates are talking about. They're saying, well, Lichtenstein has no skill. That's the criteria that they're using to distinguish the two, and I'm not sure that that's the best criteria when we're thinking about artists working in the wake of people like Marcel Duchamp, who's displaying the urinal and saying, well, skill doesn't matter, then maybe these aren't the same criteria that we should be looking at. But at the same time, as Lucy's saying, Lichtenstein's all about showing off his own skill. I mean, he's really perfecting his practice to show off how skillful he is. So there's an interesting tension. I don't know what you think about the comic book debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that were, I think in terms of Lichtenstein, Ruth and I were talking about this over the drink. That there were, I think, some unsuccessful cases where people were trying to sue Lichtenstein, and I don't know what the outcomes are. I'm sure there's information online, as James says, there's a lot of material on the internet now about those individuals, and some of them have spoken out, and there's a couple of documentaries about Lichtenstein where you get individuals involved in composite drawing whose work was appropriated by Lichtenstein talking about that. So I think there's a very open acknowledgement by Lichtenstein of the sources he's using. So in the same way he's going to Picasso or Monet or any of the other artists whose work he appropriates and keeps appropriating right from 1962. He starts appropriating Picasso, and he doesn't really. In 1969 he starts appropriating Monet, and his first appropriations of Monet, they look prints, but they look like Monet's. So I think in a way if you look at them on a par with the way that he's using the source material across his career, he's doing it because to a certain degree he admires what he's appropriating. I haven't really given a different answer, but I think
that means you now have to say that.
Well, I think that painting in the car is not just about the technique and the skill, it's about the striking image as well. And that's why I found it quite grey area, and I find it quite difficult to depart entirely from the original artist, because if it wasn't for that particular comic image, then that wouldn't exist.
I think that's a good point.
There was one other sort of thing that came up in your presentation, Lucy, thinking about the reflections. So art, pretending to be Lichtenstein's art framed and glazed in a gallery, catching bad spotlighting sort of thing. We all have that experience. You go around shows and something's badly lit or whatever, and you're doing this, and there's lots of reflection on the surface. And I was wondering to what extent this is, firstly, a sort of a self-reflection on his position as by the time he's doing these things, very successful artist. So here I am in the museum, kind of play. And secondly, how they look to us. I was thinking about the controversy letters in this vitrine, which you should, if you haven't had a look at this vitrine, it's really entertaining, where you get the angry people writing in about the purchase of in the car. It's kind of, it does surprise, wrong foots me a little bit that that's the kind of work that would be, honed in on as a problematic work to spend public money on. But anyway, that's a reaction to this work in the UK is another dimension, I suppose, of how we might think of Lichtenstein being a museum piece here. What is it for us to look at pop art here? I mean, James was talking a lot about pop art, what pop was for the artists in the United States in the context of New York and so on, or San Francisco or Los Angeles or wherever it is. In that North American context, this was a kind of vernacular to do with supermarkets and consumerism and teenagers and so on and so forth. Whereas here, we know this from the way British so-called pop artists talked about this stuff. It was tremendously exciting, sexy, and not gloomy like Britain was, and miserable and so on. So I didn't know how much, there was the first thing is about the music, his self-consciousness about being a successful artist and being on display. And then secondly, how all this stuff looks to us as pop and has looked as pop in this country.
I suppose I can say something about the reflections and in terms of us, because I think there is a nature of these. This is a big series. This is just a number of works from a much larger series, and there is a sense that Lichtenstein's at a moment, as he's sort of getting older, looking back. But actually, he does talk about. I think the formal thing is important, and he talks about starting the series because he'd been trying to make a photograph of Robert Rauschenberg drawing through a piece of glass. I assume it was framed. And he became fascinated by this distortion, and it was that formal problem coming and rearing its head again, and trying to capture something. So, but the fact that he takes his own work, and he in other parts of the series he takes the work of others, as well as kind of imaginary pieces. So there's a range of works within the series that he kind of explores. But there's a large portion of the works in the Reflection series where he does look at his own work, and obviously looking back at pop art is a very particular thing to do at that moment. And he was in his in the early 1990s, had achieved great success, was being commissioned all over the world to make public sculptures, and had achieved huge success as an artist, financially as well as in terms of kind of recognition. So I think the fact that he goes back to pop art, you might be cynical about it, but I think there is a point where he's starting to think, perhaps what was I doing there? Let me explore that again. I don't know. I can't say.
I think one of the reasons why pop art was so shocking or appalling to people in the 60s in the UK and elsewhere is because it stripped back this idea of kind of authorship, this idea that an artist expresses themselves through painting, which had been at the forefront of kind of aesthetic thinking throughout the 40s, 50s, both in America and across Europe. And this work says, well, actually, I'm borrowing someone else's composition, making a work which strips back any kind of idea of the touch of the artist, because you get almost no sense of a kind of physical interaction happening within this work. Now, from the late 70s onwards, there's a return to this kind of expressive painting, kind of neo-expressionist painters like there's Baslitz upstairs, and a real kind of return to a lot of these kind of rather romantic ideas about artists being able to struggle in their studio and express themselves on canvas. And I think that partly one of the reasons why not just Lichtenstein but also Warhol and Johns and all of these artists are returning back to their earlier practice is to actually kind of reassert what they were doing and the claims, the stakes of the claims that they were making in the 1960s, and suggesting that perhaps these things haven't gone away. There's also, at the same time, a revival of pop art in work by Jeff Koons or Chaim Steinbeck or people like that. And again, I think these artists want to say, well, we're still making work. How dare you make this kind of neo-pop work when actually we're still part of this discourse. So there's an idea of actually how this work relates to the contemporary art world of the time it was being made as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we're probably going to draw to a close. Before we do that, because I know we have to finish at 8, that's why I'm saying this, it gives people a chance to have another little bit. Okay, and it only remains for me to thank our two wonderful speakers and ask you to join your hands together. And we hope to see you at our next event.